Bereshit bara Elohim et hashemayim ve'et haaretz. Perhaps you recognize that phrase coming from Genesis 1:1. Take out your Hebrew Bibles. There's a few things I want to show you as you prepare to start your translations in week 5. When you start your workbook exercises, what you're going to want to make sure is to have your Hebrew Bible, because you need the apparatus. And you're going to be reading from your Hebrew Bible. So you will look up your passage. And first you're going to give a rough translation. You're going to do your best to try to translate initially by what you know, using your lexicon to look up any vocabulary words that you don't recognize. Once you get that wooden translation or that rough translation, then you're going to start making notes of any questions that you have, making a list of new vocabulary, identifying any verbs that you're unable to parse easily, and those types of things. And then you're going to use your Scott's Guide, Scott's Simplified Guide to the BHS. That little pamphlet is so important to what you're about to do for this class. Make sure that you have a copy of that. In the Scott's Guide, it's going to show you, first of all, you'll be able to look up the accents that you see in the sentence and know where to properly divide your sentences, so you'll know where to pause or put periods and that kind of thing. You'll also, accents are helpful to know when maybe dialogue is changing from an introduction to the actual speech, those types of things. It's very important for emphasis. Okay, so particularly, let me give you a heads up. You want to always be noting anytime there's the Ravia or a Athnach or Zakiv Katon. So use your Scott's Guide and look up those symbols and make sure that you have those, because those are pretty basic. You need to know those every time. But also your Scott's Guide is going to help you interpret any textual variants that happen. And that's down here at the bottom of the page. So what you'll do is when you're reading your sentence, you're going to be looking for any textual variants. For instance, with Genesis 1:1, with the very first word, Bereshit, you have the letter A right beside it. That lets you know there's a textual variant here. In other words, there's another reading in a different manuscript or many manuscripts, whatever the case may be. Your textual apparatus at the bottom of the page is going to help you identify those variants. So I would find the A down at the bottom of the page where it says chapter 1, verse 1, and the little letter A, and then you're going to have a series of symbols, or in this case, Greek words, and you need to know what those symbols and words mean. And in the back of your Scott's Guide, it has a code there that tells you what symbols are given for significant manuscripts. It tells you what the little symbols mean in that index part in Scott's. So you'll be able to interpret what the textual the variant is, where it's found. Otherwise, this is just going to be gibberish at the bottom of your page. So you've got to have that Scott's Guide to be able to interpret the variant readings. And then you know that the Masorah here in the margin, you've read about that. And you'll be able to look up anything that's significant there. However, your textual apparatus is going to be the bulk of that work. And then you're going to be addressing any syntax issues. How is it that you translate this passage? And in your week 4, we have some information there. I think it's 4A that's some instructions about syntax. And the Binsby workbook and this course in general typically points you towards the classical method of syntax. If you read that description in chapter 4, matter of fact, as soon as this is over, go back and read it again. But it talks about a classical way to do syntax in that your resources are categorized according to grammatical elements. For instance, your Waltke and O'Connor reference, Introduction to Biblical Hebrew Syntax, your Arnold and Choi reference. All of those are more of classical syntax references where you have categories. And a downfall to using those in this class, and I say this because I was a student here and I took this class and I know what other students have done since I've been teaching this class. What we typically do is use those resources to find a translation that matches what we already know an English version says. So really all we do is validate an English version that we're already familiar with. We look for syntax categories that are going to translate that verse in the way we know it to be read. And that's not true translation. That's just validating an existing translation. And so I would love to start pointing you towards more the discourse analysis, which is a newer approach to syntax. Really, your workbook's not going to gear you towards that, but I want to introduce you to it now and for you to be aware of it. And what I've done is I've taken away the final assignment that was in this class. It was a Hosea 6 assignment. And I've taken that away, and instead we're going to do some work in discourse analysis. We're going to do some reading in discourse analysis. And I want to demonstrate to you the difference here in Genesis chapter 1, just to give you a little bit of an introduction. And this may not make a lot of sense right now, but I think it will as you progress in your translation. For instance, you notice in Genesis 1:1, it starts with the word bereshit, which is, the root word here is rosh, which means head or start, and the bait is a preposition, so in the first, or in the head, in the beginning. And then verse 2 starts, v'ha'aretz hayata tohu vavohu. And then starting in verse 3, you have a vav consecutive. In verse 4, a vav consecutive. And in verse 5, vav consecutive. Verse 6, vav consecutive. And on and on and on. Well, you know from your intro course that vav consecutive is typical for past narrative. It lets you know we're in a past narrative story form. And so once we get to verse 3, we're flowing. We're flowing in, and the Lord said, and God said, and we're flowing in the story, and we're hit action after action after action. However, the first couple of verses, though, are not written in that form. They're written in a different form. Where bereshit, it's a particle here. We're starting with a noun, and verse 2 starting with a noun here, preceding the verb, which is a bit unusual. And what we realize in discourse analysis is that when you look at this as a whole, when you look at this whole page and you see we're flowing with, this is a typical past narrative vav consecutive story, but you have this element at the beginning that's not vav consecutive. At any rate, one thing that we learn in discourse analysis is whenever you see a pattern of vav consecutives like this, and then all of a sudden you have a disruption of that it's giving you some offline information. It's just be like if when you're telling a story to someone, say of an activity that happened to you yesterday, and then you remember, oh wait, I got to give them some background information so they understand what's happening. You may say, oh, I was at the store and I was buying blah, 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 and I was going down the aisle, and oh, by the way, I had this neighbor who I've known for a long time, and we don't get along anymore. And then I ran into my neighbor. And so, see, you had to stop the story and give some background information so that the audience would understand fully your story. Well, that's what's happening here. This verse 1 and verse 2 is giving us some background information, and then the vav consecutive, the story starts. So whenever that vav consecutive is interrupted, we're alerted to, okay, we're offline here. What is this aside telling us? And that happens for a variety of reasons, too much for me to get into now. But what I'm saying is part of discourse analysis is you have to look at this whole unit and what is happening in the verbal changes to be able to know how to translate and even what tense to translate in, those kinds of things. And I'm bringing that up because up until this point, you have probably thought of the vav consecutive as kind of that reversal element. An imperfect is all of a sudden translated in past tense because it has a vav consecutive, it's been reversed. Or perfect is now translated as imperfect because it's been reversed with vav consecutive. But if you read your Cook article, that's not really the case, is it? It's not that simple definition that we like to ascribe to it when we're learning that introductory material. So that's just a little introduction to discourse analysis. I'm going to be teaching you more about that as the course goes on. But I want you to start getting into your mind when you're translating, looking at the whole passage there and noticing when you have these verbal changes or when you have different arrangements of phrases or clauses or words, and what is the importance there. So that's the kind of things we're going to start trying to tackle as we're looking at the concept of discourse analysis. So if you have any questions or comments, let me know. Maybe you want to start doing some reading on your own in this field of discourse analysis and to help you as you're doing your translation process in BINS V.